Every time the Conservative Party has chosen another leader, it's been pretty dire for them.
It would look ridiculous, frankly, having a sixth Prime Minister in however many years.
Is Labour happier that he stays put? If he goes, there's always a sort of a slight, well, might he be replaced by somebody better? Hello and welcome to the Political Forecast. This week, just how bad for the Tories were the local elections? There's no doubt they are bad results, but were they bad enough to ditch Rishi Sunak? What can they do to turn things round, or is it now just about minimising the losses at the general election? What's the impact of Reform UK? Could the return of Nigel Farage make a big difference? And are these results as good for Labour as they might seem? With me today, the Spectator editor, Fraser Nelson, former Conservative Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, and Labour's leader in the House of Lords, Angela, now Baroness Smith. Kwasi, how bad are these results for your party?
Of course, they're bad results. But actually, when I look at the numbers and the results, I think most of them were expected. There's nothing worse than doing worse than expectations. And I don't think we've done that. I think Ben Houchen, obviously, that was a good win. And I feel that Rishi Sunak's position is safe. I don't think there's going to be a serious move against him.
Is that, in a way, the worst possible position, though? Because you end up with a loser who you're going to keep.
No, well, I don't think so. I think we've had so much turbulence and change, and I've been part of that, and we've had all these different leaders over the last few years, that it wouldn't have made sense, in my view, simply to have yet another leader who would probably have been unelected. Was certainly unelected by the country, but probably unelected by the members as well.
But what do you sense in terms of sort of, how people feel about the fact that they don't feel they can move against him?
I think
is there a sense of resignation, or is it sort of...
Resignation is probably part of the calculus. I think there's always the desire to be calm and see what happens 6 months to the election, a long time. Things can happen. There's no denying that they're bad results. But I actually feel that Rishi Sunak, it would be mad to move against him now. We don't have the time. And it would look ridiculous, frankly, having a sixth Prime Minister in however many years, 5 years, 6 years. Actually, it's 8 years. And that Prime Minister would not have a mandate either nationally or probably within the party. So I think Rishi Sunak is safe, but all in all, it's a bad set of results.
Fraser, did you pick up the same sense?
Yeah, this wasn't the calamity which some Conservatives had been expecting. I mean, there is a scenario where, the Tories lose Teesside, there was no mayoral, there was nothing to cling on to, and that Rishi Sunak is facing a leadership contest, etc. And Number 10 was always planning for this weekend. We always thought this would be the moment of maximum vulnerability, and they could see all the stars lining in the wrong way. Now, the worst case scenario has not come to pass. There is just enough for Rishi Sunak to say, look, Labour didn't do quite as well as they thought. We didn't do quite as badly as people expected. So let's hang together. Now, given the lack of real plausible alternative candidates to him, I think the Rebels would always have struggled to move. But now I think there is no question of a serious attempt on him.
I mean, there are still the sort of the few who will say, well, if we'd had Boris Johnson, this wouldn't have happened.
Oh, they're right.
Is that...
They're right. I think they're right.
Of course. No, but there's no doubt that the defenestration of Boris Johnson has led to the Tories being in a far worse position. This idea that if you ditch the leader, everybody's going to think, wow, great Tories. But you see this party feuding. I've got Kwasi to the right of me here, and it knows all about how it looks to the public. So this is, I think, those who said that ultimately getting rid of Boris Johnson did not lead to a better position. I think the jury is out, so is back on that, and it's returned its verdict.
But it doesn't mean he's coming back, or could be brought
Well, he
back.
doesn't have a seat, so it'll be hard.
Yeah.
He's not coming back before the election. There's no way. I can rule that out now. There's no way that he's going to get a seat, I think, to fight at this general election. Not that I'm not sure he even wants to do that.
No. Angela, what do you think overall?
Well, I suspect I agree with the fact that Rishi Sunak is probably not going to have his party move against him now, not because the results are particularly good, but I think there was quite a bit of expectation management from Downing Street. And they were putting a lot on these mayoralty contests. Yet across the country, they're not good results for the Conservative Party in any way at all. And I think, Ben Houchen's seat, yes, we had a lot of work, a lot of effort in there. That was more to do with the number of marginal seats we have around that area that we hope to win at the general election. And in fact, I think he's polling something like 20% or so more than his political party. So I don't think the Conservative Party could count on those seats, those votes in the general election. But it probably makes Rishi Sunak feel a little bit more secure. Will it impact on when he chooses to fight the general election? Time will tell. Downing Street are gaming everything, aren't they?
But would Labour, is Labour happier that he stays put? I mean, is there an element, if he goes, that there's always a sort of a slight, well, might he be replaced by somebody better who causes us more problems?
Every time the Conservative Party has chosen another leader, it's been pretty dire for them. So
that's not true. I mean, Boris, in 2019, people forget this, we were on 17%.
Yeah.
We scored 8.8% in the European election. And we were facing, working down the barrel of a gun. Boris came in with Cummings, whether you love them or loathe them. They actually turned things round, and we got a majority that nobody anticipated.
Yeah, for a short time, it didn't end well, did it?
No, it didn't.
And that led to Liz Truss. Liz Truss was then rejected by her own party in Parliament and had to go. You were there, you know about it. Yeah, of course. And then we got Rishi Sunak, who wasn't chosen by his own party. So all these things worked out well. So I don't think he's going to go now. I think he has to stick it out.
But would you rather he sticks it out?
Not my choice. I don't really care, to be honest. If the Tory Party...
You don't think it makes any difference?
Well, the Tory Party want to tear themselves apart on another election. I think the point you made was that they haven't got much choice of candidates now. They even have to get a foreign secretary as the ex-prime minister in because they haven't got the people on their backbenches to do the jobs now. So I don't think they've got any choice but to stay with Rishi Sunak, whether they like it or not.
I agree with that, but for different reasons. I think the whole point of this period is that we were meant to be more stable. So having another leader and putting another, circus would actually destabilise things and make things look worse.
Well, you and I both worked on that election campaign that was strong and stable, or coalition of chaos. And what happened? We got chaos from the Conservatives.
But that's my point about how fickle these things can be. I mean, we were 20 points ahead. And I remember it was April 2017, the polls suggested we were going to get a majority of 150 when that election was called. And then in the end, we had...
I mean, the last time you were here, Kwasi, I mean, you were clear that you didn't think there was going to be an early election.
No, I don't.
When do you think the election will be now?
I hope it's in October, but I suspect it'll be in November.
Why?
I think, that's just the rumour mill, what I read.
Do you think he'll want to wait until after the US election?
I think, so for the US election to one side, I think he needs time probably to have another fiscal event to show that he's going to share the proceeds of the stability that he's created, and I think he can't really go to the country. I'm sure he's calculating he can't really go to the country without some sort of fiscal event.
Fraser, what are you hearing about election timing?
Well, the working assumption I've got is that was a party conference in October. It was a springboard to a general election in November. I think Rishi Sunak is an optimist who thinks that time is his friend and that by November you'll start to see trends, for example, earnings outstripping inflation, the waiting list coming down, immigration coming down, perhaps even the Rwanda scheme picking up momentum. So I think every political leader has hardwired into them the idea that vindication is lying just around the corner. And I think he feels that he's got all these things that could come good over the summer, by November, they haven't come good now. And if he just waits, people will see, and he'll be able to point to something to say, look, my plan actually worked. He doesn't have that at all right now.
So why not wait till January? I mean, and then that gives him, as social media has been pointing out, that Rishi Sunak.
I think that would be the ultimate act of desperation, I think. And also, who's going to thank you really for a January election? Now, the Tories did quite well.
I'm not sure anyone's that keen on a November election. Now, I went through the December election and it was freezing and miserable. People don't want to come out. They don't want to answer their doors. The public will cast their verdict on a prime minister that chooses an election when they don't like the date as well. My sense is that prime ministers always think there's something around the corner.
They always do. Yeah.
It's happened time and time again. I was at number 10 with Gordon Brown.
Absolutely.
And if you think back, there was a good chance to go for an early election when he first became prime minister. He didn't take it. And I can remember Jim Callaghan, because I'm probably the oldest one here, saying that, no, we're not going to have an election. And thinking back, he might have been better going for an election than when he said he wasn't going. So prime ministers, it's a tough call to make. And there's a tendency, I think, to hang on where sometimes they should say, actually, we can't guarantee there's something around the corner. We might do better for our party if we do this now.
And when Fraser sort of lists those ideas, that you wait for ideas to come through, for the Rwanda plan to start happening, for planes to be taking off, do you think that makes a difference from your point of view?
I'm not convinced it does. Even if planes take off on the Rwanda plan, it's a very, very expensive policy for very, very few asylum seekers. And that's not going to change the landscape on this issue or deal with this issue at all, which we've always said. So I don't think that changes it. When he's looking for something economically, most people's experiences at the moment is life is pretty tough, whether they're falling down potholes and having to have their car repaired, whether they're waiting for adaptations in their home, whether they're looking at schools for their kids, the resources that are there, whether in their hospital operations. Most people's experiences now are pretty tough. They don't forget that in the space of a few weeks or 3 months. So I think it's a tough call for the Conservative Party to turn things round. Do I think we've got it in the bag? Absolutely not. But I think it's quite a gamble.
You don't, really? Are you just being sort of, polite, don't sound triumphalist?
I know I'm being very Angela and cautious. I've been through enough elections to think they don't always turn out as you want them to. But is he really going to sit there and say something's going to turn up and be around the corner that's going to be better? I think that's a gamble for him.
But the thing that the alternative is, having had a 26% swing against you in Blackpool South, he's not going to have an election in the next 2 months.
But how many
factors make a difference, though?
I think they could do. I mean, look. So you're facing inevitable defeat, and a bad defeat if you go soon, because you don't have time to turn things around. And if you wait, you might see better outcomes.
But how many by-elections will he face? Because they're coming along at some speed at the moment, haven't they? Every single one. Where the Labour Party doesn't traditionally have a good record on by-elections, the Lib Dems tend to do much better. We have done spectacularly well, including in Blackpool in the by-elections. Are we going to have the election seat by seat by seat?
But the historical precedents, everything changes obviously over time. But it's true that the by-election swings are bigger than they have been traditionally to Labour, but Labour is not actually getting the vote share that it's had in the past. It's a few points behind where Tony Blair was at a comparable point.
Well, in Blackpool, I think Labour had one of the sharpest swings it's ever seen in its post-war history there. That was quite spectacular. But we do see, the polls are quite clear that what's happening here is that support is draining from the Conservatives and not really building on Labour. Labour's still at 43%. It's not really yet. Boris Johnson almost got 50%. And we've also seen in the last, all these results, certain problems of Labour's about peeling away from the left in certain areas. We saw it lose control of Oldham, for example. We saw the problem, some issues in the West Midlands. So there is certainly the case that there is an enthusiasm for Keir Starmer in the way that there was for Tony Blair. But that doesn't really matter for Labour. All they need to know is for people to give up on the Tories. Tories have lost about half of the supporters they had in the last 4 years.
And when Rishi Sunak talked about the biggest comeback in history to sort of central office workers this week, how did people react to that?
But he had to say that because it would be the biggest. If we won the election, it would be the biggest turnaround.
But does anybody think the biggest turnaround in history is possible?
After the last few years, you would not rule anything out. Let's remember the psephologists said that Donald Trump has a 0.2% chance of winning the general election. The same psephologists gave David Cameron a 0.5% chance of winning the 2015 general election, the majority. So the history of the last 10 years has been people like us getting it completely and utterly and hopelessly wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the mood in the party, do you think the party has any belief that is possible?
I think the party is in a difficult place and they realise very clearly that we're underdogs. But having lived through 2017 as you did, no one's taking anything for granted. And so that means on the flip side, there is still some hope.
What I find interesting is a number of Conservative MPs and members of the House of Lords who will talk to me and say, look, we're done for. Are you going to do this? Have you thought of that? There is a mood within the Conservative Party I haven't seen before, even when we've won elections, that is almost fatalist.
It was like this in 96. I was a student.
See,
I knew that, nobody thought we were going to win that election.
No, but it's more than that now. No. In 2010, there was a sense of the Labour Party, look, we're not going to do terribly well in these elections, we're not going to win this election, but it's not, how bad is it going to be? It is different. And I think it's the divisions in the Conservative Party, the Rwanda policy being one thing, it divides people. And there are huge divisions along policy lines. Now, the House of Lords on the Rwanda policy, it went to ping pong on several votes. It should never have done that. The Conservatives have 106 more peers than the Labour Party.
Yeah, but we don't have a majority in that.
No, you don't.
If you add all the different
you don't. But even so, you had 106 more than us. They didn't turn up. Look at the numbers. They didn't turn up. And I think that is the sense of sort of almost fatalism. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be associated with this. And good people, some of them were in the building and didn't turn up to vote. And so I think there is a mood in the Conservative Party that divides the party members quite significantly. I think the parliamentary Conservative Party is probably a bit different to the party on the ground as well.
The party on the ground, though, by and large, the mood is, of course, Labour is likely to win the next general election, but let's start now about rebuilding. And that is the kind of... I don't think if they think this election is lost, they're going to stop campaigning and go home and give up. Or, if anything, it makes them more determined. Right. So you are now down to a small, happy few who realise what's about to happen. But what happens after that is what they're talking about. Is the party recoverable or not? That's the big question.
Yeah, and one of the factors in that, I suppose, is going to be reform, which I want to talk about in a minute. But let's first then talk about Labour. Because Labour in the local elections did face a phenomenon in certain areas of voters turning away from you on Gaza. Is it just Muslims, in which case you don't worry about it too much? Or is there something bigger going on?
I would worry about it. I don't want to lose support in any quarter, so I wouldn't put it in those terms.
So you do worry
at all. I worry about it if we lose support anywhere, even if we're picking it up elsewhere. I think the results overall are very, very good. Clearly, in some areas, Gaza did have an impact on some votes. Whether that will still be there at the time of the general election, I don't know. But we saw that in the Rochdale by-election, how it was a factor with George Galloway's party, and I can't remember what it's called, or the current incarnation of that party is now. But you are going to get issues that come up from time to time that damage a government party or an opposition party. And you have to win the trust of those voters back. And I think we can do that, but we have to make it to them.
How, though? Because you're not actually rethinking the policy at all. You're not rethinking your stance. Everyone's saying, no, we've got the right position.
But the extraordinary thing about that is a party in opposition, that there was nothing that we could do that had an influence on events, could lose support.
No, but it's the tone, isn't it? It's making people believe that you care about those people in Palestine.
I entirely accept that. And I think now we are much better explaining how we feel and getting that tone right. But we have to win back the trust of those voters. Any voters on any issue didn't feel comfortable voting for us in this election. But they can be sometimes, especially in local elections, people say, actually, I want a Labour government, but I'm not happy with something and I want to make that known. And I think we did see an element of this. You often find, across all parties have had this in local elections, but we have to win that trust back. And I'm confident we can do it.
Is there a danger, though, that you get back into a post-Iraq war scenario in which people feel, well, here we go again, Labour will always sing the American tune, it doesn't care about our people, it doesn't care about people in the global south or Muslims, frankly, in the Middle East. And that starts to grate with all sorts of different constituencies of people.
It would.
Young voters,
it would
students.
But I haven't picked that up in that sense in this election.
Maybe not yet, but is that the danger that you're facing?
If we didn't do something about it, it would, but I think we can address that.
Well, it's definitely a feature. I mean, seats have been lost. Respect to whatever the Galloway party is called, I forget briefly, but they won 2 seats in Rochdale. So you're clearly losing some voters in elections that are happening now.
But we don't want to lose those voters. We want to win them back, and that's what we'll make every effort to do. But I think this is a feature of politics, that issues can flare up, and people feel very deeply, rightly very deeply, about issues like this, and we have to ensure they can trust us on those issues. Yeah,
we should say the Galloway group is the Workers' Party of Britain.
Workers' Party of Britain.
Yeah. Sorry. Fraser, what do you make of this?
Well, there's been some fascinating analysis which draws a direct correlation between the proportion of Muslims in the constituency and the demise of the Labour vote. So basically, if it's over 30%, a very big drop in Labour vote, and reverts to zero in that way. Now, this is interesting because right now Muslims previously have been the group in Britain most likely to vote Labour, more than any other group. Now, the Muslim Council of Britain would quite often calculate that there are 34, 35 swing seats if the last election could be decided by the Muslim vote, if you want to call it that. So this raises the question, how much will Labour suffer from losing, because obviously the Gaza situation is probably the single most divisive issue in politics right now. You're still getting people on protests left, right and centre. How many of those people are going to be voting Labour at the next election? Now, personally, I admire Keir Starmer for standing so firm on this. I mean, the contrast between him and Jeremy Corbyn could not be greater on this. So I think he's probably winning more voters from those leaving the Conservative Party who admire the fact that he's sticking by his principles. Now, like most party leaders, he'll be thinking, okay, I'll probably gain more than I will lose here. And on his left flank, he doesn't really have anything organised. George Galloway's party isn't really there in force like Reform is with Richard Tice. So what we're seeing is councillors leaving the Labour Party but becoming independents and then running again as independents.
I think there's two things there. One, the Conservatives aren't picking those up. But the other thing is the motivation of Keir. Keir will do what he believes is the right thing to do. And sometimes when you say that, people may not like it initially. There can be a short-term loss, but I think there is a long-term gain when you stick to your principles.
So look, I mean,
he doesn't know
I've got to do what is right. Oh, he does. No,
I think we're being, I mean, he's a decent man and all the rest of it, but we're being a bit, we're being not realistic about this. He ran, we forget, but he ran for the Labour leadership on a left-wing ticket. He basically presented himself as the heir of Jeremy Corbyn. And then very cleverly, he's moved to the centre. So this idea that he's a man of sort of iron granite principle that just sticks to his principles all the time, I question that. I think
that's a characterisation.
I think he's been very political, as you'd expect a nimble leader to be.
Yeah, but on these big issues with international significance, he's not going to play party politics. He's made that clear from the moment he's been leader of the Labour Party, and you wouldn't expect him to either.
Yes.
Even on things like we had the lockdown, he did what he was the right thing to do. And sometimes you get criticism from your own party for doing that.
His position has shifted.
It's slightly shifted.
On Gaza.
Well, as circumstances change.
He's gone from a position where he was almost defending the withholding of food and water. He says by not intentionally.
He wasn't saying that, but it came across like that.
But actually,
the circumstances change. Whether the Labour Party says yes, we want an immediate ceasefire, or we want a ceasefire now in order to get humanitarian aid in, is a bit sort of arguing on a pinhead.
But I think
you want the fighting to stop, full stop.
What Fraser said about his contrast to Corbyn is fundamental to this. He saw what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. He saw that the whole anti-Semitism thing was really, really damaging to the party. And so he's deliberately moved away from that. And he's presented himself essentially as a sort of centrist Atlanticist.
He wasn't against the anti-Semitism of the party just because it was damaging to the party, it was damaging to the country. It's a horrible thing.
I agree with all of that. I'm not questioning his motive, but I'm just saying he has distinguished himself from Corbyn.
But just on this question, I mean, I've heard Peter Mandelson talking about this, and he says that the reason why he doesn't worry electorally so much about where this goes in the future is that he believes that there is a group of people who are voting on principle on Gaza, but they are not left-wingers. It's not that they are Jeremy Corbyn tendency economically or in any other way. They feel very strongly about Palestinians.
But that goes to Fraser's point. They're not organised. They're not organised.
What it raises the question
more than that.
Could there ever be a sort of a bringing together of people who are disaffected with Labour, whether it's the sort of people like Owen Jones and George Galloway and people who are voting this way on Gaza and people who are disappointed over climate? Do you end up with a sort of a left-wing reform one day?
That's a bit like saying if everybody who didn't want the Conservative Party all gathered together and voted differently, the Conservative Party would
everyone on the right.
You don't get everybody. There's nuances of political views, and there's always going to be nuances.
And actually, there are parties. On the climate issue, you've got the Greens. On Gaza, you've got the George Galloway point. A lot of people who are disaffected with Labour might vote Lib Dem. So there are existing parties now that can hoover up a lot of that disaffection.
And the smaller parties often do better in local elections where they can make a direct case to the voters in the area and people are more willing to look at what they could do locally. I think it's harder to cut through as a smaller party in a general election.
Well, let's talk about one, which is reform. Now, what do you think the impact of reform was in the local elections? Because the story seems to be, well, they didn't quite do as well as people thought they might.
Well, I disagree. I think they didn't stand in many seats. I think they only stood in 1 in 6 seats. But where they did stand, they got about 15% of the vote, which is where they're polling nationally. Now, right now, the big question about reform is, do they actually exist as a party? Are they simply an opinion poll phenomenon? Because to win votes, you need activists, you need networks, you need a whole apparatus, which Richard Tyson's associates just simply don't have. So it was a bit of a question for them. Could they actually fight every seat in a general election? But where they did fight, they got about as much as you'd expect them to get. The important thing was that those votes, everywhere they stood, seriously weakened the Conservative candidate. Now, Reform don't have enough to get an MP in Parliament. I don't think that's going to be the electoral impact of them. But what I do think they can do is increase Labour majority by between 30 and 70 seats. And right now, one of my big takeaways from the local elections is that Reform is a real phenomenon. And if they do manage to get worked up by a November election, they do stand to exert considerable damage on the Conservatives.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think the statistics I saw was that where Reform wasn't standing, the swing against us was much lower than the swing was where they were standing. So if you look at the Blackpool South, that's the third biggest swing since the war. Now, if Reform hadn't stood, I have no doubt we would have got more votes. And the swing would have been, Labour, of course, would still have won, but the swing would have been a lot less. Now, that becomes very important in seats where you have safe, in inverted commas, safe, I don't think any seats are safe these days, but safe Conservative seats where the Labour vote will probably max out maybe at 35, 40%.
Yeah.
But if the Reform get to 15%, and most of that's coming from the Conservatives, you can see Labour winning seats on a 35, 38%.
So why aren't
vote.
they where UKIP were? And could they be if Nigel Farage comes back?
Well, they don't have as an attractive a cause. UKIP had as a cause leaving the European Union, which, as it turns out, 52% of the public wanted to do. Reform have just got a whole bunch of frustrations that the Conservatives aren't conservative enough. If you look at their agenda, it's not far right, it's not radical, it's basically classic Conservative. And it's a yop of concern that the Tories have just jacked up taxes and jacked up spending and done the opposite of what they said they would do. Now, and also there isn't a Nigel Farage factor. I think Farage is an incredibly talented political entrepreneur who was able to sort of bend the universe towards him, as it were. And really, I remember with the Brexit Party, he took that from scratch to going first in the European Parliament elections. And there aren't that many people in this country who could do that. He's one of them. I don't think Richard Tice is.
So what should the Conservative Party do?
It's very difficult. It's a very difficult problem because on the one hand, you've got to consolidate your base. But on the other hand, you've got to appeal to former voters who are looking to Labour or looking to parties crudely on the left, more on the left than you are. So it's a very difficult dynamic. I think where Rishi Sunak is right is that when the election comes into view, people will have a binary choice because given where we are with first past the post, only two people can become Prime Minister, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. And the calculation is that a lot of those Reform voters who are voting Reform or saying they're going to vote Reform in polls, at the time of the general election, will look at those alternatives and vote Conservative. That's the thinking. Now, that might not happen.
I think that's the challenge,
that's the rationale.
I think that's a challenge rather than thinking. And a lot of the people who are standing as Reform candidates or voting Reform are doing so partly the very point you made earlier about wanting the Conservative Party to change. And they may think it's better to have the Conservative Party out of government, even if the cost of that for them is a Labour government.
There are people like that.
Because it will change the Conservative Party. And so how Rishi Sunak taxed to deal with that, you can either please some of your Reform voters and lose your moderates, or try and please the moderates and lose the Reform voters.
Yeah, it's a difficult
So I think that's quite a challenge. In my area, where I live, you've got a Reform candidate who's a former Conservative councillor, no incumbent Conservative MP, and actually it starts to look interesting in those kinds of seats when you've got former Conservatives standing Reform and their actually dislike of the Conservative Party is greater than their dislike of the Labour Party.
But if you get to the point where you're staring defeat in the face, and some people will say you're at that now, why not think about a pact, a deal?
They're not going to do a deal. I mean, Richard Tice has said repeatedly, and I don't even know what the deal looks like.
You'd lose other support, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and I just don't see any advantage to that.
So it's a matter of self-respect. No national party doesn't field a candidate in every seat. This is why, for example, the SNP isn't going to do a deal with Alex Salmond's Albert Party. And I think it's also it's also denying voters a choice. You want to at least make sure that voters have got the chance to vote for you everywhere. So a deal is the coward's option. It doesn't
It's not
work
going to
under our
happen
system.
for lots of, and I don't think it would even work that effectively.
Angela, where does that leave you in terms of how you feel about reform? You know, in electoral terms, they are doing you good. Do you think they are a good thing given the message that they put out?
No, what we do in elections, we go out with as many Labour votes as you can. And there's always other parties that take votes from your party and from the other party. You never know the impact. You couldn't guarantee that all the Reform voters are former Conservative
No, they're not.
voters.
They're not. But I'd say 60%.
In the same way that people say, oh, if the Green Party didn't stand, you would have won that election. You can't, people vote how they want to vote. The case we've got to make is it's worth voting Labour. And I think that's an easier case to make coming the next election. It is for the Conservative Party to say vote Conservative.
So I think you're right, but I think it's clear from looking at the numbers of the polling that most of the Reform votes, over 60%, maybe 2/3, is coming from former Conservative voters. That seems fairly well established.
Okay, well, as usual, we'd like to end with a long-range forecast. So what's your one big takeaway from the local elections and how will they affect the general election? What's effectively the most profound thing that's happened this week? Kwasi?
Very interesting question. I think that what struck me, I think Downing Street did a very good job in terms of expectations management. Because I think Houchen winning, he had 72%. I mean, it would have been a seismic political earthquake for him to lose. But it's a victory. And it's and actually, I think for Rishi Sunak, I think that's essentially secured him his job for until the election.
Angela?
I think that's a pretty good answer. 20% fall in your vote becoming a victory is quite an achievement for any political party to claim that. I think for me, it's the confidence of the Labour Party in terms, talking to different areas, voters on the doorstep. We could win the next election. It's looking, I'm one of these people that's very cautious, but it does feel good and it looks good to people there. And we've just got to make that case. So it gives me an optimism, not a certainty, but it gives me an optimism.
Fraser?
My big takeaway is that both parties face a serious challenge to the fringe. That reform is real, they've proved that, not just an opinion poll phenomenon. And Labour has got a serious problem as well, protecting its left flank. Now, we'll see in the next few months what that will be. I don't think it will change the outcome of the election, but it could make the difference between a huge Keir Starmer majority and simply a good Keir Starmer majority. But it'll be interesting to see.
I'd
It lays the seeds of a problem.
No. We're 6 months out. Also, the other thing that people forget is that it happened to us in 2017. If people think Labour are running away with it, there's a natural reaction to think, actually, I don't want these.
You're doing your
people
best to tell people we're not running away with it, and I think that's a fair point. We're not running away with it, but we're certainly with a good chance.
But I think if that's the mood, people will turn against Labour.
Thank you all very much indeed. That was this week's Political Forecast. Bye-bye.